If the only reason to follow God is because God said so, well, what if I don't care about what God says? You can't tell me to follow God because God wants me to follow him if I don't yet care about God. So then, how does one come to follow God without circular reasoning? The answer must come outside of the system. Now, we've already discussed in another video that reason alone can show us that we should follow God and can even obligate us. But if you've watched it, you know that that argument is pretty long and technical. And if that were the only way for people to know that they're obligated to serve God, well, then millions of people would not get there. So there must be a more basic, universal, built-in reason for why every human being should follow God. And fortunately, there is. And you likely use it almost every day. Most people follow God because they're just told to. If they don't, they'll go to hell. If they do, maybe heaven, or they'll be rewarded. But if you obey God just because of those reasons, you're only obeying God because he's powerful. And if the only thing giving God moral authority is power, then he becomes indistinguishable from a dictator. We don't obey dictators because they're right. We obey them because they can hurt us. We know that power does not equal moral. Some of the most powerful people to ever have lived were by far not the most moral. So the mere fact that God can punish or reward us does not mean that we should follow him. Now, others obey God because that's just what their family or their culture does. But that's not following God based off of your own independent reasoning. That's just cultural conditioning. If you grew up in India, odds are you would be a Hindu. Saudi Arabia, Muslim. Utah, Mormon. Same human being, but different environments lead to different truths. Therefore, inherited belief has no claim on actual truth. If your culture declared tomorrow that stealing is acceptable, does that make stealing moral? If your family insisted that you become a doctor, does that make medicine your purpose? Truth obviously lies outside of culture and family. So culture and family, which leads to blind obedience, is not a good reason to follow God. In this video, we discussed how everybody has a core moral intuition, provocatively exclaiming that you have the same morality as a Nazi. But seriously, just like we can perceive truth and falsehood, like how we know 2 + 2 = 4 is true, we also have the ability to understand basic moral principles, like the fact that torturing innocent children for fun is wrong. One of these moral truths that every human recognizes and perceives is gratitude. To perceive it, you don't need religion, you don't need philosophy. The moment someone helps you, you instantly realize that you owe them something back. Gratitude is a moral principle that's inherent in every human being. Now, gratitude exists when two things happen. You recognize that something happened to you that improved your condition. This is recognizing a goodness that you have received. And the second is that you recognize that the agent behind this goodness had good intentions toward you. The giver intentionally wanted to help you. Both of these are required for gratitude. For example, if you receive $1,000 in the mail, you feel gratitude only if it was a gift, not if it was a bribe. Same benefit, but different intentions, which leads to a completely different moral judgment. But here's what's crucial. Gratitude is not just about the benefit, it's about the relationship. When someone helps you, you first recognize, my life has just been made better, an inward focus. And then you recognize, someone chose to make my life better. This recognition leads you to realize that this person cares about your well-being. They invested in you. And the moment that you recognize that, a moral obligation appears. You realize that you owe that relationship your acknowledgement. This relationship is important because it can only happen between beings with intentions. For example, you can look at a painting, and it might give you pleasure, but you won't feel any gratitude toward it. The painting didn't choose anything, it doesn't have any goodwill, there isn't a relationship between you and the painting that you must acknowledge. But if you fall on the street, and a stranger comes and helps you, a relationship is created in an instant. You benefited, they intended your good, and now you instinctively feel that you should help them if the roles were reversed. Again, human beings recognize this effortlessly. It's built into our nature. Gratitude isn't just an emotion, it's an innate judgment. Your intellect recognizes, this person invested in me, this person intended my good, therefore I owe them something. It's a real obligation that your intrinsic morality creates. Let's take another simple illustration. George is drowning in a river. Peter sees him, jumps in, and saves George's life out of goodwill. George now recognizes two things. One, his life was saved. That's a real benefit. And Peter acted to help him. A clear good intention. As we talked about earlier, this combination creates real moral weight, gratitude. Now imagine that later, Peter asked George for a favor, $100. George only has $100 to give. Now imagine that his neighbor also simultaneously comes and asks George for $100. Who should get it? Peter, the person who saved George's life, or this neighbor? Again, we all know the answer instantly. Peter's claim of the $100 is morally stronger because he saved George's life. If George simply flipped a coin to decide, we would consider that morally tone deaf, maybe even cold-blooded. But where does this obligation come from? It comes from his intuition. It's really just like math. God created us with the knowledge to recognize gratitude just like he created us pre-wired to recognize basic math. If a cashier adds two prices incorrectly and gives you the wrong total and you correct it, even though God never commanded you to do math correctly, why do you do it? Because your intellect is wired for truth. Gratitude works the same way. Your mind is wired to recognize it. So now we come to the crux of our argument. If gratitude applies to every human benefactor, every human who benefits you out of their seemingly goodwill, but really there is a selfish element, how much more so for God, who created the benefit, created the benefactor, and who does so out of his pure goodness? Need we say that every human benefactor is also not as perfect, nor as worthy of gratitude as God? If gratitude applies to every human benefactor, how much more so does it apply to the being who created your life, who sustains you at every moment, and who gives you consciousness and the ability to serve him and live life? Therefore, you obey God not because he's powerful, not because he threatens punishment or promises reward. This would ultimately be serving him out of selfish reasons, and not just because he tells you to obey him in the Bible. Circular reasoning. We first obey God because we owe him gratitude. This gratitude is the optimal way to serve God, because it's not like we're serving him out of fear or hope, but rather we're serving him out of a wisdom of the service that is due to our Creator. It's out of a love for him and a thankfulness of life. Serving out of gratitude is doing the will of the Creator for its own sake, because our Creator says so. But this is how God's commands gain moral force without being circular. If your Creator expresses his will through commandments, then those commandments become binding through gratitude. Remember, commands don't simply become moral just because a powerful being shouts them. They become moral when they express the will of the benefactor to whom you already owe gratitude. Gratitude is that bridge that turns God's will into moral obligation. Back to Peter and George. Peter, who saved George's life, could ask George later to paint his room green. Green isn't inherently moral, and neither is painting, but the act becomes morally required because Peter asked George to do it. And George, who owes Peter gratitude, fulfills a moral obligation by helping Peter paint his room green. But there are limits. Suppose Peter asked George to jump off a skyscraper. Obviously, this is outside of the bounds of George's moral obligation, and George could rightly refuse. Gratitude obligates, but only within the bounds of reason. And the same is actually true with God. We will cover more on this in the coming weeks, but God doesn't just have arbitrary authority. His commands are also within the bounds of reason. His commands in the Torah are binding because they come from a morally perfect benefactor. Again, don't get too caught up on this, we will cover this. But let's summarize. Why follow God? We should follow God because every mature human intellect recognizes the obligation of gratitude. And when the one who created your life sustains every moment of your existence and gave you the capacity to even understand morality, asks something of you, it would be morally insensitive not to do it within the bounds of reason. Gratitude is the foundation of serving God. And it's the reason you already know deep inside of you. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, learned something. Thank you, as always, for watching.